this could not have been held at a more opportune time. Until I think the 22nd of May was the date, Australian defence policy inevitably relied on the protection of a great power, the USA, and this was a close relationship, I'm sure everyone will know, has drawn Australia into a series of disastrous wars. I don't need to tell you what they are: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. But the question we now ask is why? Why must Australia defend itself with a big power protector? And what alternative defence policies might we actually pursue? So regrettably, this is a topic that's received little attention in the mainstream media and possibly even less in mainstream political discussion. But IPAN believes that both of those questions are of huge importance at this time of seismic shift in the Australian electoral landscape. So we ask, will the new administration reaffirm the previous government's projected $250 billion spending on defence when we have so much other need in the community around us? Or will the new government seek to forge a different defence template? So the speakers that we've invited this evening offer us the promise of other alternatives and other possibilities. And we have over 180 registrations for this seminar. And this to us indicates a very strong interest amongst IPAN members on this subject. So if you're not an IPAN member and you would like to join, please put your contact in the chat box or the chat line. If you would like more information about this topic, please once again put your details in the chat line, or if you want information about any IPAN activities, we're very happy to send those to you. So once again, I thank you very sincerely for your attendance, and in expectation of a very informative and a very thought-provoking evening, I now hand over to our facilitator for this evening, Dr. Emma Shortis. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to IPAN for inviting me to facilitate what I agree is a really important event at just a critical time, particularly in Australian politics. I too, of course, would like to begin by acknowledging, in my case, here in Victoria, the Eastern Maar and Gunditj Mara peoples on whose unceded lands I live and work. And I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past and present, and acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia, where you all are. Where I am in Victoria, Aboriginal people and the state government are leading the country through its work towards a treaty or treaties with the traditional owners and Aboriginal Victorians. This nation remains the only Commonwealth country to never have signed a treaty with its Indigenous peoples. And that fact, I think, goes a long way to explaining how Australian governments behave out in the world and why and how they have supported great powers like the United States in inflicting fear and violence on the world in the name of defence. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been caring for this country for at least 60,000 years. And they are experts in diplomacy and collective security. Treaty and enshrining the Uluru Statement from the Heart, I think, could set this country on a new path, not just at home, but abroad. And that, of course, is really, I think, what we're here to speak about tonight. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce this really impressive panel to discuss the question of an alternative defence policy for Australia. We have Dr. Alison Bronowski, AM, John Lander, Major General Michael Smith, AO, and Joe Valentine. And I will introduce them all properly before they speak. Each speaker tonight will have around about 10 minutes or so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And I'll ask you, because there are so many of you here, to please use the chat function down the bottom to pop your questions in, and I'll keep track of them and put them to our panelists at the end. And I'll ask you, if you can, to keep yourselves muted. I can't mute you from here, but while our panelists are speaking. So I will now, of course, introduce our first panelist, Alison, who, as many of you will know, is President of Australians for War Powers Reform. Alison joined the Australian Foreign Service in 1963 with stints as both diplomat and author in Japan, Myanmar, Iran, the Philippines, Jordan, South Korea, the United States, and Mexico. She's the author and editor of 14 books about Australia's dealings with the world, including Allied and Addicted, and more recently, she co-edited the Honest History book with David Stevens. So I will hand over to Alison now. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And thank you, everybody, particularly IPAN, for this amazing initiative, which has now been around for 2 years. And in the meantime, of course, many things have changed. And yet, what IPAN set out to do at the very beginning remains relevant right now, because the same issues confront us as they did then, and the same questions that IPAN wanted Australians to answer have now been answered in this huge survey, greatly responded to by so many Australians, expressing their views about these things, in which many, in many ways, do not reflect those of our elected representatives. Let us now hope that our most recently elected representatives will understand and implement those views in the sorts of policies that they are going to put in place. The record, I have to say, doesn't encourage optimism, because for as long as Australia was a country, we were dependent upon first the British and then the Americans for our defense. At no point did we assume that Australia could defend itself. And so the price for that dependence was paid in our foreign and defense policies, and in many other ways, economically as well, culturally as well, and in our whole attitude to who we were. So having adopted that policy from 1901 right up until now, you can understand why it is that we're in the position we're in. And it has never mattered as much as it matters now. Because until 1945, the wars we fought alongside our British and American allies turned out in their favor and presumably therefore in ours. But if we were to fight another one in our own region at the behest of our American allies, that would almost certainly be a total disaster. The other wars we have recently fought, which Emma mentioned, except that I would add Vietnam as well, and Korea. So, okay, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, have all been disastrous. Now, if I were in Price Waterhouse and I were advising somebody about the best place to put their investments, I would look at that record and I would say, don't go there. It's a waste of money. You gain nothing. You lose a lot of money. And what have you got to show for it? That is where Australia is. And for our governments to go on repeating that behavior again and again, not only in remote countries, so-called remote, like Afghanistan and Iraq, for instance, plus you have to add Syria because we were in there too, is one thing. But to add to that list China, where we would most certainly, if there was a war, lose it. Whether we were supported by the United States or put there by the United States, and I'll come to that in a minute, is absolutely irrational. And the cost, here's the cost of war thing, the cost not only in economic terms, but human terms, and every other way, ecological, environmental terms, every other way you can possibly construct it, will be absolutely disastrous. So here we are at a situation which IPAN has smartly anticipated 2 years ago, at the very situation where independence in our foreign and defense policy, which we don't have, is what we most need. And that is why the responses to IPAN's survey, almost all of which have said yes to independence of one kind or another. Some have been a bit nuanced, some have put in various considerations, all of them carefully argued and well presented. That is why that survey is so important for us to be able to quote to those who now lead us and to guide them in a direction that not only the Australian people want, but is also best for us as a country. Now, one of the things, there are many things that I marked them all, but I'm now on a roll, so I can't go through them one by one. And cut me off, please, whenever, Emily, please cut me off when I've gone on too long. Put up your hand and tell me, Emma, stop me when I'm ready. One of the most important things that we now confront is whether our current government, which wasn't anticipated when IPAN began the inquiry, whether our current government is going to steer in one direction or the other. And what many of our respondents to the survey said was the real fundamental problem, just as identified by Malcolm Turnbull, our former Prime Minister.
Malcolm Fraser.
No, thank you. You knew. Malcolm Fraser was the alliance, the association with the American project is the thing that most endangers Australia. Now, there are people who responded to the survey who are trying to find a way in between the two, and that's very helpful and valid in terms of presenting it to the rest of the population. Some say, no way, get rid of the whole thing. Others say, we need to look ahead and balance the current situation, which is different from what it was even when Malcolm Fraser wrote that. Now, those views are terribly important for us to consider, and we have them all collected together in a way that now we can understand what Australians think, and we can offer those, I suggest, to our current leaders saying, look, this is what we know Australians' view is. And these are people from all walks of life. These are people who aren't necessarily experts. Some are not, but so many of them reach the same viewpoint. Now, coming back to my responsibility, which is to talk about foreign policy, I would agree with the late John Burton, about whom I've just read this really interesting book by his daughters, which I recommend to you, Pam Burton and Meredith Edwards. Just written the book about their parents, John and Cecily Burton. And John Burton was Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs under Evatt when he was 32 years old. That was a window. 1945 to 1949, straight after the Second World War, Labor in power was an opportunity for Australia, for once, to do something in our own interests. And Burton understood this. He got it. Of course, he didn't last because he was accused of being a communist, and ASIO was onto him. Read the book. But what he said about Australia and Asia was absolutely correct. And if you read it, it applies to now. It applies to us right now. We still, after 70 years, we still haven't got it right, because every now and again, under one government or another, you have people talking like Burton. You have people talking all the way through like Paul Keating, like Ken Henry, like we get a sudden burst of Asia enthusiasm and people say, right, this is where Australia is. Our policies ought not to be made for us on the other side of the world. And that lasts for a while until the opposing forces take over and we're back where we are. Now, we've been back there on and off, give or take a bit of Rudd and a bit of Gillard. We've been back there now for 20 years. And the great thing about what's just recently happened on the 21st of May is that suddenly, I don't know about you, it was probably the same, I guess. The clouds parted, sky shone, the teals marched up and down New South Head Road here, where I live. And all of a sudden, Australia took on a different color, a different possibility of progress. Now, we still don't know that we're there, because every Australian government since Whitlam has been very careful not to step too far over the line, because they know what can happen to them if they do. That can happen, can still happen. And that's why you find some of the words being said by our current leaders about China and this and that are a little bit, as they say, nuanced. But the fact is that what IPAN has done about putting its finger on the pulse of Australian opinion, even though it was all written before the election, is still relevant right now. Because if we use it correctly, it can act as a force to advise our new government, together with the backing of the Greens and the Independents, who will not let them get away with business as usual, right? Even though, to give them credit, they're not doing that, or not too much. But the pressure for business as usual from the United States is very strong. And that pressure involves and will involve conflict over the South China Sea and conflict over Taiwan. And all Australia has to do, and here's the foreign policy line, is do what Menzies did over Quemoy and Matsu, do what Fraser did, for goodness sake, saying that Australia was not interested in going to war with the United States over anything in China. They said that. These were conservatives. And what we need to do is recall that those statements were made not only by Labor people, but by the Conservatives themselves, because they knew where Australia's interests actually lay. They still lie there. And the most important thing for an Australian government now would be to discreetly, politely advise the United States that in any such war over the South China Sea or over Taiwan, Australia will not be a participant, will not be involved. Now, the United States always wants a coalition, and if they don't have one, they won't go. And if they don't have a proxy fighter like us, they won't go either. This is the important moment where we're at, and I really thank IPAN for enlightening us all that we are there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was such a cogent overview of kind of where Australian foreign policy is sitting right now. I was thinking just then of, you know, our foreign minister speaking Indonesian. That's exactly, I think, what you described about the sort of sudden revival of interest in Asia. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll come back to those comments about Australia's alliance with the United States. It is my pleasure, though, now to introduce our next speaker for this evening, John Lander, who, as many of you know, is a former diplomat. John worked in the China section of the Department of Foreign Affairs in the lead up to the recognition of the People's Republic of China. He was deputy ambassador in Beijing from 1974 to 76 and was heavily involved in negotiation of many aspects in the early development of Australia-China relations. He was then Australia's first ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, and he was permanent delegate to UNESCO as well. So with that wealth of experience, thank you, John. We'll hand to you now.
Thank you, Emma. I'm a little less optimistic than Alison about the possibilities of the Australian government moving away from its tutelage under the United States. We are all aware of the developments since the election that indicate that the new Labor government is doubling down on the centrality of the US alliance to Australian foreign and defence policies, and that there is to be no major reset of relations with China. Prime Minister Albanese actually said that he would strengthen the alliance with the United States. The Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, has referred to a force in Australia which drives it to see China as a rival rather than as a partner. So my remarks want to focus on the nature of that force, the dangerous direction it is taking us, and why it is increasingly urgent to mount a countervailing force. So in that respect, I agree very much with Alison and everything she said about the work of IPAN. The way I see it, Australia is and has been really, since the Second World War in particular, in the suffocating embrace of the United States, culturally, politically, militarily, economically, and financially. The cultural aspect shouldn't be ignored, because it is so pervasive that I find that most Australians simply can't imagine any alternative cultural paradigm. Most of our news is filtered through the American lens. Alternative interpretations of world events are suppressed. Most intelligence, so-called, is filtered through the Five Eyes spy network and skewed to the American point of view. We only have to think about the fiction of the weapons of mass destruction and where that led to recognize the influence of the intelligence system on our mistaken policies. The role of Australian Defence Forces in the extension of America's military might in the Indo-Pacific has of course been heavily reinforced by the invention of AUKUS, and America's economic and financial stranglehold on Australia, particularly through its ownership of key resources, has been extensively set out in the draft paper circulated by IPAN just before this meeting. So I don't need to elaborate on that, except to say that as far as I can see, that it is therein lies the so-called China threat. I say so-called because I think the narrative that China is embarked on a program of military aggression which threatens Australia is absolute nonsense. China has no history of invading other countries and has evinced no intention to do so. Its efforts to retain Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan within China's sovereign territory are not examples of external military aggression. nor are its bases in the South China Sea, which from their perspective are clearly intended to counter a potential American blockade of its vital trade routes. The Australian government, the current Australian government, has once again referred to the importance of the South China Sea trade routes for Australia. But the country for whom they are most important is China. And the notion that China would block the South China Sea trade routes is ridiculous. They would be shooting themselves in the foot, basically. And moreover, China has reached an understanding with all the rival claimants in the South China Sea that it should not impede mutual collaboration on other aspects in their relations. The USA has designated China as the principal threat because it challenges Americans' dominance of the international financial system under the rules-based order set up by the US and the UK for the benefit of the West and to the detriment of the Third World, now known as the Global South. Australia is intricately intertwined in that system and still sees any alteration as harmful to its interests. China has now reached the point where it has the largest middle class of any country in the world, whereas the US middle class is declining rapidly, with something of the order of 40% of its population at or below the poverty line, and 90% of its wealth in the hands of 1% of its population. That 1% represents the military-industrial complex, which sees huge profits to be made from war. China is able to direct capital into materially productive infrastructure and industrial enterprise, whereas US capital is largely directed into derivatives and other speculative financial instruments. China's economic rise and increasing participation in the development of many countries, 160 have signed up to its Belt and Road Initiative, is leading to growing global influence. It is also leading to the emergence of an alternative to the existing system for international trade and financial transactions. This clearly will eventually undermine the position of the US dollar as global reserve currency. And it is that position which sustains the US dollar's value and underpins the massive US national debt. All wars since the Cold War have resulted from the United States' obsessive pursuit of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which states that the US must prevent the rise of any power that could challenge its global primacy. When it is unable to compete economically, the US retaliates militarily. This is very clear in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war at the moment, where the US stated before the war began that America, in concert with its European allies, would weaken Russia to the point that it could not exert influence on the international stage. US defense policy, particularly the strategy of denial, has made clear the same intention with regard to China. The plan is to bog China down in a protracted war by proxy, like Ukraine with Russia. Under that plan, Taiwan has been the preferred proxy, but neither Taiwan nor China appear ready to give effect to the US efforts to instigate a war between them. Since they both have more to lose than to gain from a military conflict, they might see it opportune to begin serious negotiations in line with the US claim that it favors a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan problem. Despite its assertions to the contrary, I believe the US would probably not welcome any settlement that was mutually acceptable to both China and Taiwan, as it would nullify the pretext for the massive US military presence in the South and East China Seas. Continuation of the present standoff between China and Taiwan would be preferable. Either way, given that the current US strategy is still to instigate such a war through a proxy or proxies, it will have to find an alternative to Taiwan. There is no apparent reason why it would not be willing to sacrifice Australia to that role. Despite its stranglehold on the Australian economy, the US is not dependent on Australia for any crucial resource or commodity, such as the microchips from Taiwan. And I believe the US is currently pushing Australia in that direction. This is why Elbridge Colby, the author of The Strategy of Denial, amongst other hawks in Washington, has been so lavish in praise of Australia being in the, quote, forefront of the projection of American power in the Indo-Pacific. It is also why Peter Jennings, the outgoing head of America's principal agency of political influence in Australia, ASPI, said that Australia must learn from Ukraine how a smaller nation can successfully resist a much bigger bully. So it is quite obvious that the Americans want Australia to be the Ukraine against China. I don't believe that the US would engage in direct military conflict with China, just as it is not engaging in direct military conflict with Russia for the same reason, the avoidance of a nuclear war. But it would do as it is doing in Ukraine, constantly resupply Australia's capacity to defend itself in a war with China. This would mean that China would not target American bases in Australia, but it would use its missile capability, against which we have no defense, to take out any land-based assets, or indeed seagoing assets, from which Australian forces could operate. As long as the United States policy designates China as the principal threat to international rules-based order, Australia, because of the alliance, will feel obliged to maintain a certain level of hostility towards China. Australia is thus committed to acting at America's behest in pursuit of its geopolitical objectives in the Indo-Pacific, which continue to move towards war in the region. Australia is caught between a rock and a hard place. Either it accepts a fate similar to Ukraine's as the price of continued alliance with the US, or it accepts China's many and frequent offers of partnership, which of course we had in the latter quarter of the previous century, but that would incur the wrath of the United States. And I noticed someone in the comments alluded to John Mearsheimer's comment about how the United States could do Australia a lot more damage than China can. Australia's position is very much dictated by the belief that Australia has more to lose by moving away from the United States than it has to gain by moving towards China. We are not yet in a position where we can actually strike a balance between the two, although eventually we must if we are to avoid a devastating war. And I recall that when I was a junior in foreign affairs back in 1971, working on the recognition of the People's Republic of China, we put together a policy planning paper which said, amongst other things, it is more important now than ever before that Australia distance itself from the policies of the United States. Unfortunately, that policy recommendation was not taken to heart by the government then, and still has not been. but it is still, I think, true today. As Alison said, we have to move to a position where we are not automatically identified with every strategic objective of the United States. And given the present and probably permanent imbalance in respect of military capability, in a war, Australia would fare far worse than China. In the immediate and near future, Australia's best defence is diplomatic, not military. Australia's diplomatic efforts should be directed at using its intimate relationship with the United States to persuade it that mutually beneficial cooperation with China is preferable to its present combative approach. We should at least be making it clear that we do not accept such an approach, and we intend to strike a balance between them. Such a balance can only be achieved by Australia developing strong domestic infrastructure and manufacturing capability for a genuinely independent economy, supported by a multifaceted and flexible financial system. Our Asia-Pacific neighbours are setting us examples of how this can be done, as the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea put it, by being friend of all and enemy of none. Indonesia is moving to national control over the extraction and processing of its mineral resources. Further afield, Mexico, right next door to the United States, is doing likewise. And I noticed today that the Mexican president has refused to attend President Biden's next summit of the Americas. If they can do it, why can't we? Australia's independence from all big powers and maintaining friendly and equal relations with all countries would strengthen our self-defense and reduce the threat of war in our region. The current government's room for maneuver, however, is extremely small. It would take a lot of diplomatic skill to achieve anything like independent foreign and defence policies, unless there is overwhelming popular pressure from all sectors of society for change. It worked once before in the case of Vietnam, and it can work again. A nationwide peace movement is needed to persuade all interest groups, social, business, and professional, to convince the government to challenge US hegemony. There's a great deal of work for IPAN and the Anti-AUKUS coalition still to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. There was so much in that, and I particularly appreciated your examination of the nature of American power, because so much of the conversation in the mainstream media, at least around Australia, is, I think, full of kind of willful delusion and sometimes deliberate deception about the nature of American power. And you're pointing out the insidiousness of ASPI in that regard is critically important, I think, and something I'm sure we'll come back to again. It's my pleasure now to introduce our third speaker for the evening, who I hope is here. I can't see on my screen, but I'm hoping they're here. Major General Michael Smith, AO, served for 34 years as an Army officer in the Australian Defence Force. He was appointed as the Deputy Force Commander of the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor, in recognition for which he was promoted from a member to an officer in the Order of Australia. He has been active in international fora on issues relating to international security. He has published widely on these issues, including his book, Peacekeeping in East Timor, The Path to Independence. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Michael.
Thanks, Emma, and greetings and thanks to IPAN for the opportunity to contribute to this very important discussion. And particular thanks to Emma and her very accomplished assistant there for moderating the session tonight, and also to my fellow speakers, Alison, John and Joe. Now, I'm currently in Sydney attending a really Inspirational Reconciliation Conference. And as such, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal mob of the Aurora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And normally you will find me on Nunganwal country in Canberra. Now, I've prepared a paper for tonight and I've titled it Rethinking Australia's Security. And I'll send that to IPAN for those who may be interested in reading it. But in the short time available to me this evening, I'll simply highlight some of the key points. So if you want to get into more detail, you'll have to read it. Now, I'm mostly in accord with the title of the webinar tonight, but I would have certainly added the important words conflict prevention, as well as peaceful resolution of conflict. Australia's security will certainly be enhanced if our country does all it can to prevent conflict. And I'm sad to say that Australia can certainly do more than it is doing in that at the moment in that critical area. Now, I think there is general agreement that Australia's living standards and those of the world face existential threats, politically, economically, ecologically, and militarily. And this is certainly the most dangerous period I can recall in my lifetime. So it behoves all of us to do all we can to avoid or at least manage conflict in the best possible way to optimise the security of future generations. In this paper, I advocate a logical but different approach to our current defence strategy and acquisition priorities. And there are two key and interrelated actions that I believe need urgently to be undertaken by the Australian government and civil society. And these are the preparation of a new national security strategy and the commitment to a new defence strategy that accords with that national security strategy. So let me just quickly go through what I mean by a new national security strategy. And government needs as a priority to commission this national security strategy, although I'm not confident that they will. They certainly haven't done much on this area in opposition. Now, assuring the well-being, prosperity, resilience and protection of the Australian people is the primary and most important responsibility of government. And Australia's national security strategy must reflect the key interests of the majority of our citizens and should not be prepared by a select group of ministers and departmental officials. And it needs to be set against our values, which we haven't currently got articulated anywhere. We talk a lot about values, but we don't need them. And in the paper, I've suggested a few, but the important thing about the values is that they must be measurable and they must be attested to. A good starting point, however, for our national interests would be to reflect and build upon what Senator Penny Wong, now our Foreign Minister, of course, said in her 2017 address to the Lowy Institute. In that address, Senator Wong suggested that Australia's overarching national interest was our identity and our power. And she articulated 4 principal national interests for Australia: the security of our nation and its people, the economic prosperity of our nation and its people, a stable cooperative strategic system in our region, reflected by our cohesive neighbourhood, and constructive internationalism supporting the continued development of an international rules-based order. Now, clearly, Australia's defence strategy and ADF capabilities and priorities should sit within and contribute to our key national interests identified in a new national security strategy. In the paper, I go on to say that unfortunately we don't have one now. We did have one in the last Labor government, but we don't have a national security strategy now. And in considering national security, defence strategy is but one important element, as recognised in the national security policies of other countries, including our AUKUS partners, by the way, the US and the UK. And I'll return to AUKUS in a moment. But major threats to national security for all countries are as much and often more frequently domestic rather than global in nature. The historic decline of major powers generally can be traced to internal domestic disorder and external military overreach, the latter being economically non-productive except for armaments industries and their employees. Now, China's global power has been rising for some time, and the US has been under considerable stress from both these traits that I've just mentioned, placing it in a position of relative decline. Now, as much as most Australians, including me, might like for the US to remain the supreme unipolar power, that is neither the reality nor the environment in which Australia must live, survive, and hopefully prosper in the 21st century. And so, rather than aligning Australia totally and unreservedly to the US, we need a hedging strategy and to use our influence with our major ally to help shape a different US approach. I want to emphasise that I am not against the Australia-US alliance, only the way it is being enacted by Australia, which, in my opinion, makes us less secure. And without a workable plan B at this critical time, Australia could foolishly take action contrary to our key national interests. In the paper, I talk a bit about China and the US, and I won't go into that because I don't have time, but it pretty much supports what John and Alison have already said. Now, as our most important ally, Australia should encourage the US to do everything possible to de-escalate the current arms race in the Indo-Pacific. At present, the US and its allies, including Australia, appear to be promoting an arms race and raising the prospects of war. For our part, Australia should make it very clear to all parties that we have no intention of engaging in war in North Asia, and we should withdraw naval and military assets from this volatile region wherein our presence is not and will not be a determining factor. Now, in Australia at present, we face numerous challenges, some would say crises, all of which have a direct impact on our country's national security, resilience and prosperity. And in the paper, I've listed these, but they won't come as any surprise to you because we're dealing with them daily. The point is that fixing all these challenges to improve our national security will be far cheaper and more productive in helping to make Australia a safer place than acquiring defence capabilities to contest an unproven threat from China in North Asia. In the paper, I talk about where we've drifted in the last 20 years. I won't go into that now. Firstly, the war on terror, and secondly, which led us into the Middle East and far away and caused huge discredit to our elite special forces. And I talk about where the current threat is now being talked about now as China. And I believe that both of those were misguided for us to be doing. Australia has securitised its international posture, and we have foolishly degraded our diplomatic presence and skills. This diplomatic deficit has been proven in a number of reputable reports, yet we have continued to cut our investment in diplomacy and fail to promote the professional development of our diplomats. And here I think it's very sad that we've gone down this road, and what's sad, what's happened to DFAT and also with our overseas aid. The important point here is that medium powers like Australia must be active and effective diplomatically and show leadership in multilateral fora if peace and security is to be enhanced. Now, I sincerely hope that our newly elected Labor government will act quickly to appoint a national security advisor and commission the development of a new national security strategy, building on the good work of the last Labor government. But I'm not confident that will happen. Regardless, the development of a new national security strategy cannot be left to government alone, and certainly should not rest principally with government departments and those national security colleges and think tanks that have failed to advocate for such a strategy for the past decade. Accordingly, it will be critical for civil society to demand a national security strategy from our government and to actively participate in its development. And in the paper, I provide some views on how I think that should be done. Now, the second key action is to review our defence strategy to ensure the ADF's force structure and defence capabilities are optimised and aligned with the new security strategy. And most of the paper actually goes into this. I don't have time to do it all, but what I point out is that just as the war on terror diverted our prime military focus, as well as resulting in the unintended consequences of the reputation of our elite special forces, so too does Australia's inconsequential plug-in support to US military operations in North Asia and the Indian Ocean. These operations might be good for testing military interoperability and advancing military careers, but it is difficult to see how they enhance Australia's national security. So where I come from this is if as a starting point we were, without a national security strategy even, to adopt Penny Wong's 4 national interests, then we might say Australia needs or should adopt a layered and more self-reliant defence strategy by rekindling the concept of defence in depth. And we need to cease giving priority to procuring long-range offensive platforms and weapon systems that only promote a regional arms race. Now, in this way, Australia will demonstrate a non-threatening posture to others and better contribute to the maintenance of peace. This approach will require, however, a cultural mind shift by defence planners, and it will require strong political leadership to make them discard what Alan Gingell has referred to as our historic fear of abandonment, and with it, our consequent over-reliance on distant allies. And I think in going down this route, Australia should consult more purposely with and learn from our Anzac cousins in New Zealand. So what might this reappraisal of Australia's defence posture and capabilities look like globally, regionally, and at home? Well, in the paper, I talk about the need globally to do far more with the United Nations. We need to re-engage purposefully to support the UN in all aspects of conflict prevention, arms control, peace building, security sector reform, and peace operations. And I give examples of where we have done this so well in the past, but over the last 10 years, we've let it go. Regionally is where I believe most of our focus should go in the defence sense. And our prime defence effort should focus on operating more collaboratively with New Zealand, Indonesia, and the Pacific Islands family in the Southwest Pacific. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't have defence presence in Southeast Asia and in many other countries of the world. We do need military diplomacy, but that's not where we would be conducting our major operations. And I argue fairly strongly in this section of the paper that the fundamental aim in the Southwest Pacific would be to help ensure a zone of peace while being able to purposefully engage with our neighbours to help them manage their many sensitive security issues. And in addition to conducting surveillance, military training and exercises in a partnership model I'm talking about here, we would be able to collaborate better on disaster mitigation and recovery, thereby addressing the challenges of climate change. Partnering nations might even agree to a suitable acronym such as PANs, Pacific Islands, Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand, to provide ballast to these arrangements. I think that would be far more meaningful than AUKUS for our security. Australia's priority of effort in the Southwest Pacific would be our prime contribution to the US alliance. In essence, This is the fulfillment of the Guam Doctrine, where US allies are expected to contribute more to the alliance, just as we successfully did for UN operations in Timor-Leste, when the US provided diplomatic and logistic support, but no military forces. Now, to operate effectively in the Southwest Pacific, which is a huge and vast area, we will continue to maintain defence modernisation program. And in this section, I explain what I think is required in that way. I won't go into it in detail now. And I also highlight a couple of the priorities that we need to do. The utilisation of submarines throughout the Southwest Pacific and Australia's littoral should determine the type and quantity of that Australia procures. And this decision should be made in consultation with our Pacific partners. I'm not a submariner. I don't know a lot about submarine warfare, but I do believe that the path we've embarked on now for nuclear-powered submarines and where they will be deployed is quite silly. Now, Australia's support to the UN and our closest neighbours in the Southwest Pacific really represents the practical limits of our expeditionary operations. But what about that third layer that I mentioned, homeland defence? And this is no less important than global and regional dimensions. While foreign occupation seems a remote possibility, the government needs to assure the Australian people that they will remain safe from potential threats. Strengthening defence at home is both justifiable and non-threatening to anybody. A whole of government approach is required in which defence would be a major contributor. And more thinking is required on this because we haven't done much on this since World War II. But in the paper, I list about 9 initiatives that I think we could start on. Now, the cost of a realigned defence strategy, such as I have mentioned, will be significant, but it should be achievable from a commitment of around roughly 2% of GDP, perhaps a bit more. Savings can be made by reviewing current long-term but unassured commitments and by limiting expeditionary operations to support the UN and our friends in the Southwest Pacific. In concluding in this paper, I say that Australia's security and prosperity is under considerable stress. The newly elected Labor government must give priority to the development of a national security strategy that reflects the wishes of the majority of Australians and charts a positive course for future generations. Defence is one important component which needs to be realigned to accord with this national security strategy. Our alliance with the US remains important, but it requires significant recalibration. And finally, I encourage people to read Alan Beam's recent book titled No Enemies, No Friends, Restoring Australia's Global Relevance. This book is particularly helpful in explaining Australia's persistent security shortcomings and provides a sensible pathway for a better and more secure future for our country. I agree with Alan that our first step is to reconcile with First Nations people and give meaning to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I second your hearty recommendation of Alan's book, which I agree is just a fantastic and forensic examination of Australian foreign policy, as was the talk you just gave. It was very thought-provoking, and I particularly like the idea of IPANs, is it? Replacing AUKUS. I think that's a really food for thought, I think, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our final speaker for this evening, Jo Valentine, who is a West Australian mother, grandmother, Quaker, teacher and activist. Jo's focus since 1978 has been on challenging the nuclear industry and more recently in participating in the Alternatives to Violence project, working in prisons. Jo, as many of you will know, was a West Australian senator elected in 1984 as an independent for nuclear disarmament and then going on to represent the Greens in her third term before she resigned in 1992. Her long-term activism in the peace movement and as an advocate for non-violence is typified, I think, by her involvement in Quaker Grannies for Peace, which involves non-violent blocking of military activities like the Grannies Tea Party, blocking Talisman Sabre activities in Queensland in 2015. So with that, I will hand over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Emma. And greetings, everyone. Firstly, a full and heartfelt acknowledgement of Whadjuk Noongar's, whose generosity the people of Southwest Australia enjoy. Let's hope that the new Prime Minister Albanese's first and last words on election night see the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart in this term of government. So I'm glad that Mike mentioned that as well. Gratitude to IPAN for inviting me to share a perspective which will probably be seen as outlandish, Pollyanna-ish, even, never mind. Someone's got to keep stating what I see as the bleeding obvious, that preparing for war is not the way to peace. Backtracking to 1661, when Quakers presented their peace testimony to the newly installed monarch, King Charles II, in which it was declared, "We utterly deny all outward wars and strife, and fightings with outward weapons for any end, or under any pretense whatever. This is our testimony to the whole world. Therefore, we cannot learn war anymore." During a time of political upheaval, Quakers and other dissenters were viewed with suspicion by a very fragile new government after the turbulence of the Cromwell years, during which Quakers, then one of the many new religious groupings, had refused to take up arms for either side. They suffered for their stand then and have mostly adhered to the peace testimony ever since for over 360 years. It's one of the main aspects which drew me to Quakerism 50 years ago. It's based on the belief that there is goodness, even a spark of the divine in every person, which leads to the goal of treating all people everywhere with respect. Most people of faith would be anti-war, and there are lots of representatives of such groups within our IPAN community. But what about anti-militarism? Sadly, as you all know, Australia's history is replete with fighting wars on foreign soils on behalf of other nations, while still ignoring the frontier wars fought on this soil. A high level of courtesy to the military continues unabated, with John Howard responsible for igniting new loyalty in his Anzac-ery, as I call it, encouraging young Australians to go to Gallipoli to commemorate the pointless deaths of so many young Australian men. What is it with our country that 3 of the days, which most of us recognise each year, are so negative? There's Australia Day, better labelled as Invasion or Survival Day, then Anzac Day, when we should be saying not only lest we forget, but never again. Then the Melbourne Cup, where we gamble on the torture of horses being beaten around a racetrack for our enjoyment and profit. Recently, we've had then Defence Minister Dutton beating the drums of war against China, not clever by any yardstick. Early signs from the new government don't look good either, except that there is better recognition of Pacific neighbours as sovereign states whom we must respect. But the commitment to the American alliance, described as dangerous by former Conservative Prime Minister Fraser, as Alison reminded us, is as strong as ever, as is commitment to the new AUKUS, tying us into the stupidest, not silliest I would say, but stupidest, spends on nuclear submarines, with a $5.5 billion tag for getting out of the deal with France. Absolutely nothing except bad vibes to show for it. I wonder whether the new government's line-by-line scrutiny of expenditure to cut costs will extend to the military budget. So why this unquestioning acceptance of huge so-called defense expenditure in this country? Much of that goes to the interoperability requirements of the United States military. For example, the long-range F-35 fighter jets, which we do not need to defend our continent. We're very fortunate to have an air-sea gap around our shores, which should be a distinct advantage in maintaining security, but it's mostly overlooked as we rush to enmesh our forces with those of our so-called great friend and ally. It's getting worse by the day. From 2011, when President Obama decided upon the US pivot to Asia and informed the then Prime Minister Gillard that a rotation of US Marines would visit Darwin annually, she seemed pleased rather than questioning. Of course, the number and seeming permanence of US troops on Australian soil has increased and is unwittingly accepted by most Australians. The upgrading of Pine Gap facilities, tying Australia further and further into the warfighting capacity of the United States, is almost unnoticed by the wider public. Unfortunately, we have a revolving door syndrome between the military, government advisors, and former government ministers when it comes to military matters. This is the state capture syndrome, so clearly enunciated by the Australian Democracy Network in their recent report, Confronting State Capture, in which the arms industry is one of their 2 detailed case studies. During Malcolm Turnbull's prime ministership, it was declared that Australia was aiming to be one of the top 10 arms manufacturers in the world, as though that was desirable. The Swedish International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, annual statement of military expenditure for 2021 had Australia ranked 12th in the world on military expenditure. Why on earth? Increasingly, remote-controlled weapons of war take a huge toll on human lives and on the environment. Of grave concern is the huge amount of embedded energy in the weapons, whether they're used or not, and the fact that the military forces of the world are collectively the biggest users of fossil fuels by a long way, a factor which is omitted from nations' inventories of greenhouse emissions. Manufacturers and traders in arms don't care to whom they sell their wares, and in some instances may even be fanning the flames of war to ensure good returns for themselves and their shareholders. Part of the problem is the politics of fear, creating an enemy when none exists. I reckon we're addicted to militarism, if not to war itself. It's a kind of national psychic numbing to the reality of our circumstances, referred to by Rod Bauer in the latest edition of the Saturday paper as moral injury. For those of us alert to the conundrum of communities' blind acceptance of militarism, that we feel a betrayal by leadership malpractice over generations. Australia should be in good relationship with all its neighbours and trading partners. That doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything another country does, and we used to have a good reputation for speaking up and acting upon human rights issues. Not anymore. Our treatment of asylum seekers has been appalling. Recent arrivals are just the beginning of future onslaughts as people have to flee from the ravages of the climate crisis. We should have been practicing sharing and generosity as a rich country, but instead we've resorted to torture and fear-mongering. Also, the ongoing disparity between living standards of the oldest living culture in the world and all the boat people, that's us, who've come to these shores since 1788, hardly gives us a clean slate in criticising others. Imagine for a moment if our defence budget was truly defensive only, cut to allow for patrol boats and patrol aircraft around our shores, but not buying submarines, especially nuclear, which would, if ever becoming a reality, probably be obsolete before they hit the water. One commentator recently wrote that Dutt was like a kid in a candy shop going to the arms traders conventions. I'll have one of those and a couple of those. Oh yes, that too. Promoting militarism by such bizarre events and by the almost incessant rehearsals for war, stupidly called war games, there's nothing gamey about them, which cost bucket loads of money, must be challenged. Consider even half of the military budget expenditure going towards what our country really needs: aged care, childcare, disability care, the increase in wages, which the business sector says we can't afford whilst raking in huge profits, education, including deprivatization of universities so they become once again places of learning rather than businesses, upgrading our manufacturing sector so that when the next pandemic hits, we're not so dependent on international supply lines, and environmental management so that instead of slashing the endangered species list, which was one of the last tasks Susan Ley undertook before the election, and of course, attention to the climate crisis, ensuring that transition to renewable energy doesn't result in job losses for those currently working in the fossil fuel sector. I had naively thought that the pandemic might usher in a kinder community globally, that people would see how interconnected we all are, no matter where is home on this precious little planet. But inspiring Indian writer Arundhati Roy reminds us that the globe is like a huge chess set with players ready for their next moves, and whoever is first in, best dressed after an upheaval wins. Multinational corporations were all ready to pounce on any opportunity offered by the discombobulation of the pandemic, but the progressives around the planet were a tad slow off the mark, which is understandable considering the international conglomerate's extensive networking and expertise in maintaining the status quo for their own benefit. However, there are pockets of hope and inspiration if we care to look for them. So despite the fact that recognizable peace movements have existed for over 100 years, like the International Peace Bureau founded in 1891, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom founded in 1915 in the middle of the First World War, and although some would say such citizen movements have been ignored, we must acknowledge that there is a huge body of work and effort which has produced a raft of possibilities for the future. The League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations, formed with the very best of intentions, have often been stymied by vested interests. Consider the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, all of which could be met with ease if only the global community cut its addiction to militarism. For generations, ordinary citizens have been calling for an end to war, but I contend that we must also call for an end to militarism in all its insidious forms, with its tentacles reaching into so many unexpected places. It is the mindset of militarism which needs to change. We have seen the power of nonviolent revolutions in our time, but too often the benefits are short-lived. Who would have thought that a Marcos Duterte regime would be reinstalled in the Philippines? And the Arab Spring uprisings have not evenly distributed better outcomes for the populaces which had faced repression for so long. But people in the streets generally know what's right and what's wrong, and sometimes to their great cost, they challenge the authorities on a massive scale in committing wholesale civil disobedience. Of course, there will be casualties, but probably not nearly as many had an angered citizenry taken up arms against their oppressors. So despite its risks and shortcomings, how can we promote the idea of a non-violent way to solve disputes from the personal to the international levels? It's worth looking at some of the main proponents from the 20th century, like Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King, practitioners of non-violence, and writers like Gwyn Dyer, Canadian historian, who recently delivered a TED talk on the matter, and Ackerman and Duval's A Force More Powerful, A Century of Non-Violent Conflict, published in 2000. And of course, there is a myriad of international organizations devoted to ending the nuclear arms race and to demilitarization in general. So the ideas are there, but promoting them to the general population so that they are taken seriously by governments is quite another matter. But IPAN is doing a good job thus far, especially with its amazing inquiry, which will be revealed shortly. Back in the 80s, I was part of various active peace groups keen to challenge the government of Bob Hawke, with Kim Beazley, called Bomber because he was very excited by military hardware, as Defence Minister. He wrote a rejoinder for the 1990 book, The New Australian Militarism, co-edited by Graham Cheeseman and St John Kettle, in which various authors wrote chapters outlining a possible new defence strategy for Australia. There were proponents of either armed neutrality or social defence, like Brian Martin, whose 1984 book, Uprooting War, still rings true. It seems that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Armed neutrality would be a huge shift for any Australian government to contemplate, and an even bigger challenge to mainstream mindsets, which would be the idea of social defence. It is possible for Australia to disagree with the US and to remain in good relationship. The same should be true of China, everybody's biggest trading partner. What is required is an independent foreign policy so that we can take our modest place on the world stage without being subservient to any nation. Social defence requires an engaged citizenry, trained in non-violent resistance to our own government if necessary, and certainly to any outside aggressor, although we have no natural enemies. It remains to be seen whether the new Labor government will stick to its word in supporting the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. We should follow the lead of Aotearoa in establishing a Ministry for Peace and Disarmament, which would show our Asian and Pacific neighbours that we mean well and that we're not merely a lackey of the United States. We once had an ambassador for disarmament back in the 80s, and some good initiatives were rolled out, like the strong support for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the internationally acclaimed Canberra Commission, which made some excellent recommendations regarding disarmament, most of which have not been implemented. In these days of cyber warfare, technology can be used for good or evil, as we know. So perhaps the power of social media could be harnessed to expound the ideas of massive non-cooperation, which can bring a government or oppressive force to its knees. But of course, a preferred option is to build good relationships with all neighbours based on mutual respect and justice. Soon, Australia will engage again in the Republic debate. Perhaps we could extend the options to a dual cutting of ties with the US as well, voting for independence both ways, so we could truly claim our sovereignty, which would only be possible if we had already embraced the Uluru Statement from the heart. As John Lander already quoted, I was going to finish with this too, our Pacific neighbours say, friend to all, enemy to none.
Thank you, Jo. That was a tour de force, and what a wonderful note to end on. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, and the chat has been going off. So I will pull out a few questions if I can and merge some, because there are definitely some themes emerging. I think I would start by asking really all of our panelists, because of course you've all addressed Australia's relationship with the United States and the way that informs our defence policy in different ways. And Annette put that comment in the chat about Mearsheimer, kind of outlining what happens to American allies who attempt to express independent foreign policies. So I'm wondering if our panelists could maybe reflect on, the possibilities for, I think Mike used the term recalibrating our relationship with the United States, or splitting with the United States altogether, as I think Jo was suggesting, how that might happen and how Australian government might navigate the almost inevitable consequences of that. So I'll open it up to our panel.
Well, I might just comment on that quickly. I think the implication of my remarks was that we are faced with a choice of accepting the lesser of two evils in the trajectory that we're on at the moment. And I agree with Jo that if we apply intelligent diplomacy to develop a mutually beneficial cooperative relationship with all countries, that includes the United States, and with China, war is much less likely. I'm very pleased Michael spoke about the neglect of Australian diplomacy over the last 10 or more years. But, I mean, the whole purpose of diplomacy is to prevent conflict from happening in the first place. And Australia has not directed itself at conflict prevention at all. It has been led to believe that conflict is inevitable. The United States simply tells us that China is a threat and conflict with it is inevitable, and we swallow that without really reflecting on what exactly is the nature of this so-called threat from China, and does it really exist in any kind of military form? And if it's a non-military threat, then we need to look at the ways that we can deal with the other aspects that may or may not be threatening our well-being. And for that, we have to have an intelligent and respectful and meaningful dialogue with any country with whom we have relations. And nothing has been done about opening up a dialogue with China. Over the last few weeks, China has made many overtures to Australia to indicate that it is willing to enter into a dialogue, and basically they've been rejected. Premier Li Keqiang said, let us review the past. That is a diplomatic way of saying, let's have a look at these bans that we have imposed on Australian goods in the recent past and the reasons for them and how we can get rid of them. Prime Minister Albanese just said, well, first get rid of all of the bans and then we might talk to you, which is not a way to open up a diplomatic conversation with a great power.
Emma, I just add my thoughts on it. Look, the US alliance is extremely deep. I don't think there is a popular Australian position to ditch the US alliance. All the opinion polls that have ever been done show clearly that most Australians want the US alliance. But equally, I think if a poll was done about, do you want to go to war with China? Most Australians would say, definitely not. So in our past, we have stood up for our national interests and been supported by the US in doing so. And there I'm thinking of things like our leadership in Cambodia was supported by the US. Our role in Timor-Leste was supported by the US. I can tell you, having been heavily involved in Timor-Leste throughout the whole process, I don't think Australia could have done it without US diplomatic and logistic support. So there's nothing wrong with us having an alliance. It's the way we're managing the alliance. And to invoke the ANZUS Treaty to go to Afghanistan and Iraq put us in a really stupid place. And we know that. Most Australians know that. Go and talk to the families of servicemen who suffered there. It's just another chapter like Vietnam. We should have stood up to that too earlier. And so we can contribute to the US alliance if we do more in the Southwest Pacific. But over the last 20 years, we've been pulled always away from there. And the Southwest Pacific has become not our main area of concern, it's become other places. So I really don't think we should be talking about ditching the US alliance. ANZUS, in a sense, is already dead because New Zealand's no longer part of it. But the AUSMIN has grown and it's got to a stage where, and that's what's led to AUKUS now. And of course, what's really contributed to the Quad. So these are the things we need to stand on and have positions on. And at the core of this should be, what are our national interests? Similarly, we need to fess up to the Australian people about whether or not having any military bases on Australian territory, causes a threat to Australia, and the nature of that threat if we have military bases. But we could turn that around. I actually addressed this in the paper I wrote. We could turn that around. Australia provides a fantastic training ground for a range of military forces. We could bring military forces together for training in Australia. That's different from basing rights. That's a totally separate issue.
Just very quickly, I agree with everything you said, Michael. I hope you didn't, I didn't give the impression that I was advocating ditching the alliance with the United States. I agree that it is a question of managing it and managing it to our advantage, and indeed to United States advantage, because I think the present drive of United States policy is not to its advantage any more than it is to our advantage. And that's why I said we need to have really deep, intelligent dialogue to work out collaborative arrangements with all the major contending parties. Otherwise, we're just going to be caught in the middle of a conflagration.
Can I make a suggestion? What about if we influence America to cooperate with China in creating a global community, the vision of its president, to tackle climate change?
Of course, I think that's a key issue, and it is one that President Biden and President Xi Jinping said that America and China would cooperate on, but heading into a war is simply not going to enable cooperation on climate change. So the general parameters of United States posture towards China need to change in order for them to be able to cooperate on a globally important issue like climate change.
Alison or Joe, I'm conscious of time. Would you like to jump in?
Just a very quick point. I think it was John who said we've been suffering the suffocating embrace of the US. Well, it began to feel to me like we're in an abusive relationship. You know, we have been used and abused, I would say, by the Americans, yes. Notwithstanding, you know, the support we've also got, as Mike said, with Timor-Leste and so on. But they use and abuse us. We're so convenient with that big desert, with Pine Gap in the middle of it, and with the Five Eyes network. We are geographically and strategically very, very important to the US, but I think we suffer from that. And of course, we are targets with the basing of American Marines in Darwin. And, you know, I'm afraid I'd prefer us to get out of the alliance, still maintaining a friendship. We can have a discourse. And of course, we need to be, as the Pacific neighbors say, friends to all, but enemies of none. And I reckon we could do that if we cut our addiction to the military expenditure, had items which are suitable for Australia's defence only, and didn't jump every time the Americans asked us to, and ask how high.
Perhaps a final word to Alison.
Sorry,
John. Just conscious that it's 8:30 already. Alison, did you want to jump in and add anything?
I would. And I think, at the risk of repeating myself, what we have to do for the first time in many, many years is carve out an independent foreign and defense policy for ourselves. And no government in Australia since 1975 has dared to tell the Americans that that is what we will do, for the simple reason that they look at what happened to Whitlam and they're terrified that it will happen to them, because the Americans are very good at destabilizing governments, and they can do it quietly or they can do it loudly. And there are 22 different places in which the United States has destabilized government this century. Our governments, all of them know instinctively that they don't want to be the next one. Nobody will talk about it. Everybody goes around believing this nonsense that the United States alliance has preserved the peace. What peace? It is, we are living a lie all of the time. And it's only thanks to organizations like IPAN that people have the opportunity to tell the truth. And until people recognize what is going on and acknowledge independently what is good for Australia, not necessarily for anybody else, we're not going to make the kind of progress that all of us have been recommending this evening. I was teaching at ANU, and I said things like this a few years ago. And I said, do not expect the United States to defend Australia if it's not in their own interests. And a young woman came up to me with tears in her eyes and said, what are we going to do? Well, the answer is, of course, don't emphasize guns and tanks and submarines, emphasize diplomacy and good neighborliness, and may I say, good international citizenship with our neighbors, because this is the only way for a middle power like Australia to coexist in the territory where the large animals compete. Otherwise, we will be trodden down in the same way as Ukraine is being. And I'll just add one point to that. Watching Ukraine, in which Australia doesn't have a direct interest at all, is a salutary lesson to us for what we can expect. Because as others have said, the United States looks after itself, naturally. All nations do. But what the United States is doing is trying, and Biden has admitted it, trying to wear down Russia to the last Ukrainian. And that, as the president of Ukraine himself said, when he was speaking to our parliament, he said, what is happening to us? You could be next. He said it. Now, we need to be aware of this because Australia is expendable, both to China and to the United States, as has been mentioned this evening. And what we need to think about is not this old boys stuff with the United States, which counts for nothing. But what would happen if Biden and his successors go forward with trying to push China down from its aspirations for world leadership and say, the US is great again, America is back? Who is expendable in such a conflict? Australia. And for the first time, the war is here. I mean, first time since 1945, the war would be here because China would regard Australia as expendable and an exemplary target to show the United States what it could do if it had to. And the United States would stay out of a war with China at Australia's expense. Now, if that is not logical, and if there isn't an answer to it, I defy anyone with any sense not to understand what it is that we have to do.
On that note, I can see in the chat and in
Thanks,
people's
Alison.
faces how much they'd love to continue that conversation, but unfortunately we are over time. So I would like to thank our wonderful four panelists so much for such a stimulating discussion, and hand over now, I think, to Annette for some closing remarks.
thank you, Emma, and to all the panelists tonight. I think the need to stimulate discussion, and that is the bottom line if we are to build a strong community-led movement with the desire to be a peaceful and independent country that opposes war and works for peace and concentrates on the serious issues that face us around climate change and economic injustice, pandemics, etc. So tonight has been the second in a series of webinars looking at the history of Australian government's approach to defending our people. We are very pleased that so many people registered, and we will be in touch with all of the 180 or plus people who registered with a recording of tonight's webinar, and we'll include the papers that John and Mike have spoken about or to at tonight's event. As I think it's just so important that we, each of us at this webinar, take it out to friends, colleagues, family, and get the discussion going. It's so important. The next webinars we're looking at is where the Alliance is taking us is one, and another looking at restructuring our defence forces towards a continental self-defence, a little bit like what Mike talked about, rather than offensive military forces. So there was so much has come out of the presentations here tonight, and I just want to finish by reinforcing the recommendations to read Emma's book, and I'm hoping we might get Emma to do a book launch here in Brisbane still. That's still on my agenda to try and organise. But also Alan Beam's book that's been recommended. I haven't read that yet, but this is our task as citizens to get the conversation happening and work towards that peaceful, independent position for Australia. Thank you very much to the speakers again, and to everyone who has attended. I think we had 115 people at one point out of the 180, which is pretty good, and most people stayed right to the end. So good night, and we'll no doubt be in touch. Thank you.